because they're the centre of the textile trade, which is what brought the East India Company to those shores in the first place. India in 1764, which is the date of the Diwani, produced about 40% of the world's economy, GDP, at a time when, well, certainly at the foundation of the East India Company, Britain produced about 7%. How? Through textiles. India made the greatest textiles in the world, not just elaborate silks and gorgeous kalamkaris and beautiful embroidery hangings and wonderful cotton, but this simple, plain, white piece cotton, as they called it at the time, which was the mass-manufactured, very high-quality cotton, which the East India Company found they could sell all around the world, so much so that you get deindustrialization in Mexico in the 1780s because of the sheer quantity being imported by the company. Now, this enormous economy passes over not to the British government, not to Downing Street, not to the British Army, but to a private corporation whose representative in India in 1764 is Robert Clive. The man next to him is Archibald Swinton, and anyone who enjoys the movies of Tilda Swinton, the actress, might be interested to know that it's her ancestor Archibald Swinton to the left of Clive, also receiving the Diwani. Archibald Swinton had just lost his hand in a battle. You can see he's actually missing a hand in the picture, having been shot off in the Battle of Buxar. But this document effectively privatizes the three richest provinces. Just like occasionally the British government hands over prisons to G4S security in order, as a privatization thing, to have it in theory, run more efficiently. So this document means that the economies of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa will now be administered by the East India Company. And, of course, what this leads to, being a corporation, is what we today would call asset stripping. It's absolutely plundered, and the profits sent straight back to the boardroom in London. So let's start at the beginning of the story. Next slide. This is the East India Company headquarters in London, an incredibly modest and unprepossessing building, 5 windows wide. It's not even the 2 big buildings on either side, it's just the small block in the middle. This is where the East India Company is run from in 1765 when the Diwani is captured. If you look at the bottom, there are no signs, there is no billboards, no corporate announcement that you're passing one of the most powerful buildings in Europe. And indeed, in this picture, the ladies and gentlemen in the front, in their frock coats and their lovely billowing gowns, are walking past it and the fences without apparently being aware that they're passing anything important at all. But behind those 5 windows are the clerks and the administrators who pull off one of the most extraordinary corporate coups in history. The company in 1760 had less than 12,000 men in the whole of Asia. How on earth did they take over the richest country in the world? The answer is that they borrowed money from willing bankers, particularly the Jains and the Marwaris, who they'd welcomed to Calcutta in the way that Dubai or Singapore welcomes merchant bankers or hedge fund managers today, by saying they don't have to pay any tax. And they borrow money from them, and with that money they buy a mercenary army, which by 1799 consists of 200,000 Indians at a time when the British Army has only 100,000 men in it. So the corporation has an army double the size of the British Army, privately run effectively by the directors of the East India Company in this building, sitting in the boardroom in the middle window in Leadenhall Street in the City of London. Next slide. And this is the man who founds it. He's the kind of Richard Branson or the Vijay Mallya of 17th century London. And this is him in old age, Sir Thomas Smythe. And 17 years before this picture, next slide, please, he summons the richest men in London and offers them the chance to invest in a new venture that he's planning. And he summons them to the Founders Hall in Moorgate Fields. The founders were a guild who made brass. It's founders as in brass foundry rather than founders of a something or other. And you can see from this document, which is the first document of the East India Company, that the Mayor of London, who's number one on the list, gives £200. The next guy, George something or other, gives 1,000, and the next guy gives 200. So we actually have the list of the initial subscribers, and the big guys at the beginning are giving 200 or 300, £1,000. But this document goes on for about 25 pages, and by the end, the little guys who are hosiers, haberdashers, leather workers are giving 5 shillings, 10 shillings, 6 shillings. Anyone can invest. It's different from a guild where you have to be a weaver to join a weaving guild or a merchant adventurer to join a merchant adventurer guild. With this, anyone with money can invest it and get a share of the profits. And this is a new Elizabethan idea. It's not the first company to do it. The first one is the Muscovy Company in 1585, but it's kind of the third or the fourth, depending on how you historians squabble over this. But the East India Company, founded at the end of the reign of Elizabeth in 1599, the same year that Shakespeare is writing Hamlet and Julius Caesar. In fact, if during the writing of Hamlet, Shakespeare got stuck and wanted to go for a walk to get some inspiration, he could have crossed London Bridge from the Globe, walked along to Moorgate Fields in about 25 minutes. And suddenly, to be or not to be, the inspiration comes, and he gets the ending of his play. But this is exactly the same time. It's the same year that is happening. And they buy, with the profits of this fundraising, they buy a ship. Next slide. And they get a captain to sail it, Sir James Lancaster, not necessarily an obvious choice, in that he just sunk the ship in the top left-hand corner on the previous year on his way back from the Spice Islands. But no one else in Britain had been to the Spice Islands, and the idea was to do what the Dutch had just succeeded in doing, which is to sail to what we would call Indonesia, the East Indies, the island of Run in particular, which is actually nearer Papua New Guinea than it is Java or Jakarta, and to ship directly from the producers the nutmeg, the cinnamon, the pepper, and the spices, which traditionally had come from Indonesia to Kerala or Sri Lanka. And if you go to the National Museum in Colombo, just down the road, you'll see all the coins that were left by the Roman sailors who came on exactly the same trading mission. From Colombo or Anuradhapura to Roman Egypt, to Berenike, from Alexandria, making it all the way to Hadrian's Wall, where we have a little ivory tablet from someone called Gabba, who bought 2 denarius worth of black Indian pepper at the fort of Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall in Northumberland. So all this pepper had been travelling for centuries through middlemen. The idea of this voyage was that you cut out the Venetians, the Arabs, the Indians, you go straight to the source, get the pepper. But in 1599, England was a small, aggressive nation facing off against much richer powers, such as the Portuguese and the Spanish, who are now quids in Aztec and Inca gold from South America. And Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake and these other privateers, as they called them, or pirates of the Caribbean, as we know them in Hollywood speak today, raided these vessels and enriched England on the proceeds of New World gold, which they captured. Exactly the same crew recruit in 1599 to the company. A lot of them actually put down when in their register of who they are, that they are privateer. So James Osborne, privateer. Peter James, privateer, John Stewart, privateer. So these are guys who are kind of, Johnny Depp's crew signing up on this voyage. And in due course, when they get to the Spice Islands, they don't even bother landing because by pure good fortune, a large Portuguese carrack comes sailing out of the harbour towards them. They just board it because they are pirates of the Caribbean, transfer the contents of the hold into their hold, sink the Portuguese ship and sail back home again, and sell it for £1 million in London. Next slide. And that allows them to buy this building in Leadenhall Street, the first of a succession of buildings in this same spot. That's the same place and the same facade as the last East India Company building we saw, but this is its predecessor by 150 years. It's a kind of looks like a Tudor pub with lovely balcony. It's got clearly a sort of warehouse down below with double doors where they can put the sacks and the donkey carts full of pepper and so on. It's got a boardroom or some sort of public gathering room on the first floor and maybe offices on the second floor, and pictures of jolly ships with pennants afloat on the high seas at the top. Next slide. So all this goes very well. They buy a dock at Deptford where they start manufacturing ships shortly afterwards. Next slide. And over the next century, they do very well because India is at the peak of its riches. This is exactly the same period that Shah Jahan is building the Taj Mahal in Agra. India is awash with money. It's never been richer. It's not, in the modern Indian imagination, the Mughals were looters who looted the rest of India and gathered their wealth. In fact, it's industrial wealth, like 18th century England. It's the wealth of the textile trade. So when you see a Bollywood movie of Hrithik Roshan as the young Jahangir or whatever, or Akbar, whatever he is, throwing somebody out of a window, all that wealth and all those pigeons and all the jewels that Aishwarya Rai is wearing come really, in reality, from the textile trade, which is powering the whole machine. And it all goes very well because they're making vast fortunes. But the Mughals are Central Asian nomads and not into sea power. They don't think about ships and so on. But the Brits do. So the Brits quickly realize that they can monetize this very high quality, cheap textile production by exporting it around the globe. And the Brits are not initially the only ones. There are Danes at Serampore, Portuguese at Hooghly, the French at Chandanagar, and a whole variety of Europeans competing to buy this at the best prices and sell it on elsewhere. But ultimately it's the Brits who do it with a ruthless industrial efficiency for which they're becoming renowned, and they begin to dominate Bengal until the reign of Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb, today the hate figure among Hindu fundamentalists in India, the most sort of obnoxious of the Mughals, who brings down the empire by falling out with the Hindus who are his main fighting force. And as the Mughal empire falls apart, this creates a problem for the company. Next slide. Delhi in 1707, at the death of Aurangzeb, is a city of over 1 million people. It's the largest city between Tokyo and Istanbul. It's a gorgeous place. Next slide. Next 2 or 3 slides in a row, slowly. This is Chandni Chowk. Next one. All this comes to an end in 1739 when this guy turns up, Nader Shah. Nader Shah is just succeeded in overthrowing the Safavids of Isfahan and taking over Iran, and he comes to India, as he tells his surgeon, to pluck some golden feathers from the Mughal peacock's tail. So it's a looting expedition. He realizes it's a very rich country, and the current Mughal emperor, whose name is Muhammad Shah Rangila, is ripe for looting. He's a cross-dressing tabla and sitar enthusiast, fascinated by the arts, completely hopeless on the battlefield. Next slide. And in Karnal in 1739, a small Persian army with the latest military gizmos defeats a massive Mughal army, thanks largely to these wonderful sort of mounted cannon, which Nader Shah had thought of putting on camelback, and the camels lie down and they become the equivalent of a tank, a mobile artillery. He uses these very cleverly in the Battle of Karnal, wipes out the Mughals, and then he invites Muhammad Shah Rangila on the left to dinner. And the idiot just goes. And he brings his dancing girls and his musicians and all the usual fripperies. And Nadir Shah gives him a lovely dinner, some wonderful Persian khoresh, no doubt. And then at the end of dinner says, my dear, I think you'll remain here tonight as my guest. And his bodyguard are disarmed and he's captured. And 2 days later, they march into Delhi together with Nadir Shah traveling on the back of Muhammad Shah Rangila's elephant. And it's all done in a very civilized and apparently peaceful manner, but it results 6 weeks later in the Nadir Shah leaving Delhi with 8,000 wagons filled with every precious jewel, all the gold, everything the Mughals had looted from the rest of India ends up in these wagons, including the Kohinoor, including the Darya-Noor, its sister, which is now in Tehran, including the Peacock Throne. Everything that was valuable in Delhi just gets carted off to Iran by Nadir Shah. Next slide. Now, it's as if the engine of the Mughal Empire has been put out. There's no coal to fire the boiler anymore. Imagine you take a big mirror and you go up to the top of this library and you throw it off the roof and it hits the ground and shatters into 1,000 pieces. That's what happens to the Mughal Empire at this point. What had been a unified empire stretching from Persia on one side to Bangladesh on the other, to the north of Afghanistan, to the north, down to southern India, suddenly becomes a patchwork of city-states: Tanjore, Hyderabad, Pune, Agra, Jaipur, Jodhpur, Udaipur. All of them become self-administering, competitive city-states. And the two powers who take advantage of this are not Indian at all. They are the French East India Company and the British East India Company. And these are the British East India Company sepoys. It looks more like a pride parade, I grant you, but this is the cutting-edge sepoys of their day, despite their little Nancy shorts and the nice little cummerbunds and all the rest of it. These guys have taken on board the military innovations of Frederick of the Great of Prussia: mobile, horse artillery, infantry with muskets, file firing, and these guys begin to wipe out much larger Mughal cavalry forces. Next slide. And in 1756, there's a moment of crisis. This guy, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, this is a painting from the collection of Archibald Swinton, whose picture we saw on an earlier slide. Siraj-ud-Dowlah goes off and decides to take the British trading port of Calcutta because they've been rebuilding the walls without his permission. Now, by pure bad fortune for Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the previous day, literally, next slide, this man had turned up in Madras in the south of India. This man is Robert Clive. Now, Clive had been operating rather like the British in the invasion of Iraq on dodgy intelligence. Just like that story about yellow cake, which never existed, led to the British and the Americans going in and toppling Saddam Hussein on the basis of completely false intelligence. Clive has just arrived in India on the basis of another intelligence error. In this case, a report that the French were arming up a fleet to send to India. This is the run-up to what the British call the 7 Years' War, what in America is called the French and Indians' War, all that Daniel Day-Lewis stuff, you know, Daniel Day-Lewis leaping over waterfalls with all those pretty girls in The Last of the Mohicans, that war. And in fact, the French fleet had been heading for Canada to fight Daniel Day-Lewis, if you like. But the British had got the wrong end of the stick, and they'd been told that they were heading for Bengal. And Clive has turned up to head off the French and arrived in Madras feeling very silly because he's travelled for 6 months and there's not a single French ship anywhere to be seen. He imagines, he's going to arrive and there's going to be smoking ruins of Madras and the French will have wiped out everybody in southern India. Not at all. There's no one there. Everyone's looking very peaceful, and everyone in Madras looks rather surprised to see Clive turn up with this crack fleet of ships. But the next week, news comes that Calcutta has fallen to a completely different enemy, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. So Clive is able to go north, save Calcutta, and become the hero and use his fleet, where previously it would have been completely wasted. And at this point, and this is the crucial moment in the story, he gets a letter. And the letter comes from the banker who runs the Bengal finances, a man called the Jagat Seth. And he's a Marwari banker, a Jain, and he has already put Siraj-ud-Dowlah's father on the throne. Siraj-ud-Dowlah is the product of this man's machinations. But he's now irritated with Siraj-ud-Dowlah for attacking the British, for behaving like a complete monster. And so he writes to Clive and he says, look, take out Siraj-ud-Dowlah. You've already reclaimed Calcutta, take it a stage further, come up to his capital in Murshidabad, it's just 2 or 3 days walk from Calcutta. Finish Siraj-ud-Dowlah and I will pay you £1 million sterling. And I will pay the company £1 million sterling. Clive doesn't even hesitate. Yes, sir, no problem at all. And so without any authorization, although of course in those days it would have taken 6 months to get a reply from London to a request like that, he just marches on Murshidabad, takes it. And then there's the famous Battle of Plassey. Next slide. So this is how we see Plassey, the great battle that started the British in India in our history books. Clive on a horse, heroically charging forward. In reality, next slide, the main general on Siraj-ud-Dowlah's side was also in the pay of the Jagat Seths, the bankers. He'd already been bought off, and halfway through the battle, he just marches his troops off the battlefield, leaving Clive in charge. Siraj-ud-Dowlah is captured, killed, and Clive walks into the treasury and just stuffs his pockets with gold, and then puts the remainder onto 7 barges and floats it down to Fort William in Calcutta. Years later, Clive is summoned before Parliament with the parliamentary inquiry and asked why, with no authorization, he attacked Siraj-ud-Dowlah and why he just helped himself to the profits. And he replies, rather like sort of Boris Johnson in the COVID inquiry, he said, "My lords, I was astonished at my own moderation." And everyone falls about and laughs, and he gets away with it, like Boris Johnson, more or less. Next slide. So, 7 years later, another battle is fought, the Battle of Buxar. The Mughals have tried to upend the company, and there is an alliance between the Mughal emperor, Shah Alam, sitting here, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and the Nawab of Awadh. And these 3 Mughal armies converge, take on the company, very nearly succeed in defeating the company. Crucial moment. But there's premature celebrations, and by pure bad fortune for the Mughal army, the British barges which are meant to evacuate them don't arrive. So they have to fight on. And the Mughals by this stage are popping champagne corks and having a jolly time, and the British haven't yet sort of been removed from the battlefield. So when everyone's beginning to leave their position, they fight back and they defeat the Mughals. It's one of the kind of strangest battles in history, but it ends with the company in charge. And this is the point that Diwani is signed by Clive. Next slide. And with the money that they get, having seized and now owning the richest province in India, the equivalent of seizing the Bay Area today, owning Apple and Microsoft and Hewlett-Packard and all the rest of it, they spend the money that they have on increasing the army. And the army grows from 20,000 sepoys to 40,000 sepoys, next slide, to, by 1799, 200,000 mercenary Indians signed up in East India Company service. It's the largest army in the world, largest trained military force with proper drilling and modern weaponry. Next slide. And now there's a whole new business model, because in the old business model, the British would ship out gold from London to India, they'd buy textiles, and then they'd sell home again and sell them for a profit. The new business model is much more attractive. They don't have to ship out gold because they just tax the Bengalis. And with the tax, they buy the textiles, which they then ship abroad. And then they realize that they don't really even have to do that, because they can grow in the marginal land around it the opium poppy, which they can sell to the Chinese. The Chinese will buy the opium. They can buy Chinese tea, which they can then sell in India, in Europe. And next slide. In Boston, the Boston Tea Party is East India Company tea. So by this stage, the company has moved from being this slightly dodgy Tudor startup to being the first multinational corporation with tentacles. It owns the whole of India now, having conquered it by force, with Indian armies using Indian capital, bizarrely. They've now got a tentacle, they've seized Hong Kong, and they're shipping opium into Hong Kong and taking tea out, and they're selling it all over the world, including America. And so, incidentally, sparking off the American Civil War, American War of Independence. Meanwhile, next slide, they have their own flag, which is the basis of the future Union Jack. Next slide. Not the Union Jack, the future Stars and Stripes. The Leadenhall Street headquarters, which we saw first as a Tudor pub, then as a 18th century sort of terraced houses, now looks more like Buckingham Palace by the time that they've seized half the world. Next slide. Inside the director's boardroom, the whole of Asia is controlled, from Hong Kong through India, through in 1798, the conquest of Kandy, finished in 1815. Sri Lanka is added into the mix. And so you guys are conquered not by the Brits, but by this corporation, by this multinational, almost as an hors d'oeuvre to Burma, which follows soon after. And we also forget, but the East India Company also, just as a little sort of pudding course, gobbles up what's now Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Yemen and Aden. So they have this string of ports leading all the way from the Gulf, through Sri Lanka, right round Bombay, Madras, to Calcutta and to the Burmese coast. And then finally Hong Kong. All owned by one English business, still operating out of one office in the City of London, still a private enterprise for the profit of its shareholders. Next slide. It has this huge East India Company docks where Canada Wharf now is. Next slide. It has these extraordinary second set of docks, Brunswick docks, where they make 500 clippers a year, which move the opium and the tea and the cash and the jute and all the other products. By this stage, about 25% of the British public is involved in some way or another in making sales, producing the tar. It's the biggest single employer in Britain, but it's also the biggest corporation in the world. And in a crucial moment in 1740, when there's a famine in Bengal, when they are, when the company, through over-extracting, brings about a famine that causes its own bankruptcy. In the case of the East India Company, unlike Lehman Brothers, the East India Company is now too big to fail. And in 1840, it's bailed out. They tried to get the new Bank of England to bail it out, but it hasn't got enough money to bail out the massive debt which has grown, having bankrupted Bengal and asset-stripped Bengal, having strangled the golden goose which laid the golden egg. They have to get the British government to buy in 50%. So from 1740, and this is the crucial thing, the East India Company becomes what we today, I suppose, would call a public-private partnership. And from that moment, the British government has a political and a commercial interest in all this company. So that when, next slide, in 1857, finally, having defeated every other potential enemy in India, the company's own sepoys rise up in a mutiny against the East India Company, joined by half the population, which is why this uprising is called in India the First War of Independence, because it isn't just the sepoys. In Lucknow, for example, the entire population joins in. So when this happens, the company is nearly toppled, and for a whole year it goes in the balance. So easily the company could have been overthrown. But in the end, the company recruits, next slide, a whole new army from the Punjab. It hangs half the Delhi population. Massive war crimes, much worse than the more famous Jallianwala Bagh massacre of the 1920s. About 100,000 people are killed in cold blood in Delhi in 1857 to 8. Anyone involved is called back, and there's bounty, and they're hung. Often many innocents get hung too. But this is such a mess, so many people are killed, next slide, that the Parliament finally decides to roll up the company. And this is the cartoon in Punch, execution of John Company. The company become notorious for blowing sepoys from the mouths of cannon. And this cartoon has East India Company House, that little Buckingham Palace that we saw earlier, being blown. And as the scrolls and logbooks and charters and accounts are blown out of the mouth of the cannon, it's nepotism, blundering, avarice, and misgovernment. And as the Times puts it later in that year, the East India Company is rolled up with less fuss than a regional railway bankruptcy. So this corporation, which had been so powerful, in the battle against state and corporation, in the end it's the state that wins. Several other situations, it had looked very different, because as well as attacking Tipu Sultan and the kings of Kandy and the rulers of Mysore and the Marathas, the company at the same time is bribing the British government at home. In 1690, 100 years into the history of the company, for the first time, the governor of the East India Company is caught passing a bribe to a parliamentarian, money in a brown envelope, passing hands. He ends up in the Tower of London. Since that point, the company becomes adept and invents the mechanism of corporate bribery, which still powers democracy today, corporate donations to elections. So the company not only buys MPs, many returning, these guys go out at 16, they come back often as young as 35 or 40 with fortunes. They buy a rotten borough, they enter Parliament. And by the 1790s, I think it's 30% of Parliament is ex-East India Company personnel, because they can out-bribe anyone else. And 80% of parliamentarians have shares in the company. So either way, the interests of the company mysteriously becomes the interests of the state. Now today, when you look at election financing in any democracy, when you look at what Adani is doing financing Modi in India, or similar corporate, I don't know, ExxonMobil with the Bushes, or those huge corporations that pay the money into the parties that win the elections, it's the same process, but it's invented here by the East India Company. So the East India Company is fighting wars in two directions. It's not just fighting the kings of Kandy, it's fighting democracy at home and bribing its way into power. In the end, with the East India Company, the state decapitates the corporation. But it's not at all clear in the future whether it's the corporation or the state which will win today when you use your mobile phones and feed that data harvesting. You all will receive in your social media feed tomorrow, having sat in this room, adverts for East India Company tea or whatever it is, as your phones register what I'm talking about and feed you the adverts which you're interested in the way they do. That is a form of power arguably more than having horse artillery and better muskets, which the East India Company had. I'll just end with Warren Hastings. Next slide. Final slide. Warren Hastings, the only time that the company is hauled properly before Parliament and put on trial, but typically with the British Parliament, they get the wrong guy. They actually get one of the few nice Governor-Generals, and they put him up for trial through a whole series of terrible misunderstandings. And though it's very interesting, because when the Lord Chancellor stands before the bar in Parliament and begins the trial of Hastings, he said, "My lords, corporations have neither bodies to be punished nor souls to be condemned. They therefore do as they like." Thank you.